If she felt that she had received pressure, it was her obligation, her responsibility to come to talk to me, and she did not do that in the fall.
And now he's trying to paint himself as the victim in all of this. I don't think Canadians are buying that.
We don't have the mechanisms to go through the fishing expedition and the kind of witch hunt that the Conservatives would like to see.
To the comment that we're here to try to embarrass the Prime Minister, he's doing that all on his own.
He has used his power of privilege to silence her.
Hard to believe it's only been 1 week since the Globe and Mail first reported those allegations that the Prime Minister's office allegedly in some way pressured Jody Wilson-Raybould. Since then, the former AG has kept very silent, and the Justice Committee has now limited who it will hear from. So for a government all about openness and transparency, are there consequences here for the Liberal brand? At Issue is back because it's just been one of those weeks. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Chris Hall joins us tonight here in Ottawa. Okay, let's start where we left off in that little clip montage of what happened at that Justice Committee meeting yesterday. I mean, I certainly didn't watch that with great expectations, but what do you make of how the Liberal government moved to limit who we would hear from? I'll start with you on this, Andrew.
Well, you say advisedly the Liberal government, supposedly committees are freestanding, but I think we saw once again what a fiction that is. It was a pretty disgraceful performance. I suppose the fix was always in. They were going to find some way to shut down any kind of investigation on this, but to do so in the way they did, by pretending to have an investigation where the only witnesses you call are the ones that have nothing to do with it, and where you don't actually investigate the issue at hand, but you investigate some of the sort of larger philosophical questions, it was a sham through and through. And unfortunately, that is a fairly accurate view of Canadian politics, that we have very weak institutional mechanisms for holding governments to account.
So was it the right move, Chantal? You know, if the government's trying to move on from this story, was that the way to handle it?
There's no moving on from this story until Jody Wilson-Raybould talks or says she's never going to talk forever. So this couldn't have been a way to shut down the story. It's going to only keep going, if only because then it moves on to the Senate, where you saw today senators who are Indigenous came out in support of Jody Wilson-Raybould. There will be interest in the upper house in this story. But I did learn two things from what I saw yesterday. The first is that so far the Prime Minister seems to have convinced most of his caucus to stay in line on this and to support his take on whatever happened. And two, I think the Liberals up to a point are buying time, because at the end of the day, they probably believe they're going to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould. They probably figure that they have no interest in saying anything before they hear what she has to say.
That's probably fair. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I'm personally delighted by the thought of reviewing the Shawcross Doctrine and all sorts of arcane things about a law that's already been passed as the last page of a multi-hundred-page budget bill. But to the broader point here, Chantal raises an interesting question. We are waiting to see what Jody Wilson-Raybould ultimately says. The suggestion that she can't appear before the committee when she has a lawyer by the name of Thomas Cromwell, a retared Supreme Court justice, and is a lawyer herself, I'm pretty sure, as some of the opposition members were saying, that she would know what she could say and not say publicly without violating the solicitor-client privilege. That's number one. Number two, they really haven't said what other witnesses they're willing to add, but there are people who have direct knowledge, who have been lobbied extensively by SNC-Lavalin since this whole thing began, when they were rejected, and even before they were rejected for a plea bargain arrangement by the Director of Public Prosecution. So there is an opportunity here to rethink this behind closed doors on Tuesday. I know Andrew doesn't like that, but if you're going to come up with witnesses and you're going to understand what the breadth of this study is, they do have one more opportunity on Tuesday to get this right.
Okay, except let's turn to some of the brand issues around the government, as I mentioned, a government that has talked a lot about openness and transparency. So to limit the scope of a committee, to move it in camera, to try and stop Jody Wilson-Raybould from talking in any way. I mean, what kind of damage is being done to that notion, given what we've seen over the past few days?
It's too early to tell, seriously. And to your point of trying to stop Jody Wilson-Raybould from speaking, seriously, once she gets a legal framework that tells her from the person she is paying for what she can say and what she cannot say. She can come and say it to you. She can come out and write it and put it out there. One way or another, the fact that a committee is not going to call her in is not going to stop her from giving or taking.
Yeah. So how much worse does it get then, Andrew, if we're all presuming, and I think the Prime Minister's office too, that Jody Wilson-Raybould has things to say, is going to figure out what she can and cannot say, and is going to say them? How much worse is this going to get?
Potentially much worse. I mean, she would not have resigned, I think Chantal's made this point, if she and the Prime Minister were anywhere near on the same page on what was said to whom, by whom, et cetera. We could hear, any day, we could hear tomorrow from the Prime Minister if he chose to, or from Jerry Brutz, his principal secretary, or the other officials in the Prime Minister. We could hear their side, but they choose right now to simply brief people off the record behind the scenes. So, it's not just Jody Wilson-Raybould we're waiting to hear about it. But to go back to your previous question about what damage does this do to the Liberal brand, well, they came in on a supposedly we're going to have a more ethical government. They could not look more like they have something to hide if they tried in the last few days. They were supposedly more feminist, more interested in Indigenous reconciliation. Those two are severely damaged. They weren't going to have omnibus bills. Well, the provision at the center of all this was slipped into the back pages of an omnibus bill. They have trampled over everything on which they supposedly stood for, and it's all coming back to bite them.
But is it strange that for now we have not heard people speaking up? I mean, we called a lot of people yesterday to try and get people to say something about how they felt, and there were not a large number of caucus members who were questioning things. I mean, they felt downtrodden, certainly, but not ready to denounce anybody, and certainly not at a point where they don't believe the Prime Minister. Chris, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I talked to a number of longer-standing Liberal MPs who can remember the days of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin when caucus was a more freewheeling place to express your concerns and your ideas and to tell the government where you thought they were misstepping. That doesn't happen anymore, in large part, these people say, because Jerry Butts and Katie Telford, the two most powerful people in the Prime Minister's office, attend caucus. They're not MPs, but they're there anyway. So people, especially the rookies and the people who haven't been around as long, are quite worried about it. The one other thing that comes out of this, Rosie, we've seen Wayne Long, who's a St. John MP who spoke out against the small business tax, is saying he believes there should be an inquiry. I don't know if he's speaking for a lot of people, but there is a sentiment there that the longer this waits, the more damaging it becomes, particularly if Jody Wilson-Raybould gets the chance to speak, and we all think that she probably will, it becomes more and more problematic as if her speaking time comes closer to the election campaign. Sure. It'll be fresher in voters' minds. The women who voted for this government last time, Indigenous groups who saw a real path of reconciliation, this will become more of an issue for them the longer it takes for her to be able to speak.
Chantal.
But at the end of the day, if you are the PMO and you're assuming that she will speak, a reasonable assumption apparently, you probably do not want to put your take on the sure. issue out there and give her more material to cut you off at the
I kind of think the Prime Minister's already said a lot of things. He shifted the blame to her this week.
Yes, but as Andrew rightly points out, there are others that people will want to hear from and that will probably come up in the wash if she does speak. So I think they figure they're better off waiting to see how much damage they need to control. I did note also that between the Prime Minister suddenly throwing her under the bus, and I think that is how it came across, and today when suddenly the PMO is saying it's terrible that some people are anonymously saying bad things about her, there seems to be a new shift in the PMO strategy. So maybe we'll see 6 or 7 more before this is done.
Andrew, how does this, this is a terrible question to ask anybody, but how does it end? Like, if you're a Canadian watching this at home and you're trying to understand what this is about and what happened here, how do you look at this and think, okay, well, we'll get these answers this day, or someone will investigate and get to the bottom of this, or I will know, in a month's time what really happened and why it matters? Should we hold out any hope about that at all?
Not a great deal. The pattern in these things in Canada is, again, as I say, because we have so few actual institutional mechanisms to hold people to account, they have so many ways of having convenient memory loss, et cetera. that I think the more usual pattern is it dissolves in a haze of one person says one thing, one person says another thing on the specific question of who said what to whom in the Prime Minister's office. There's a lot of other questions to do with why this provision was put in the law in the first place, whether SNC-Lavalin is actually eligible for the thing itself because they haven't actually met the conditions that are required for it. There's a lot of other questions that I think can be addressed and can be answered, but who said what to whom, we'll see. I don't hold out a lot of hope.
Can I add just one last thing, Rosie? I think that two things that we haven't really had an answer to. One is why was Jody Wilson-Raybould shuffled out of justice in the first place? Because that really is where this all goes back to. And secondly, the Prime Minister felt compelled to speak to her in September to reassure her that a decision on prosecution was hers and hers alone. That was before they even knew what the Director of Public Prosecutions was going to say about whether SNC-Lavalin qualified for this deal. So there are still many unanswered questions on this that really go to the heart of why Jody Wilson-Raybould is no longer in cabinet today.
And it's an odd thing to have to say.
Last word to you, Chantal, on that.
Yes, well, we're assuming that he talked in September with Jody Wilson-Raybould to reassure her, but we don't know that. He could have made a case for her to intervene even before the public prosecutor came to a decision. And at the end said, but of course it's your decision. We don't have the context for this reassurance of the Prime Minister, so how can we judge?
That's right.
Okay, well, we raised lots more questions that I need answers to, but I appreciate it. Before we go, thanks everybody. Be sure to subscribe to @Issue the podcast for extra content. This week, we're talking about Saskatchewan's carbon tax challenge. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.